A lonely rancher's life changed forever when a Bigfoot tribe showed up at his door. This is my story, and I'm only telling it once. I was 71 years old, dying of cancer, and waiting for the end to come. My wife was 3 years in the ground. My son wouldn't return my calls. I'd already written the letter telling the county to auction off my land when I was gone. Then came the first snowfall of November 2019, and the elk on my porch. Gutted, skinned, the hide folded beside it like a gift. No tire tracks, no boot prints, just barefoot impressions in the snow, 18 inches long, leading from the tree line to my door and back again. I should have been terrified. But what they did next, that's what I can't stop thinking about. I've never told anyone this story. Not the whole thing. Not the way it actually happened. My name is Virgil Crenshaw, and for 50 years I worked a 1,200-acre cattle operation in the Bitterroot Range of western Montana, about 40 minutes from the nearest town if the roads were clear, longer if they weren't. And in winter, they usually weren't. By the fall of 2019, I was 71 years old and preparing to die. I don't say that for sympathy. It's just a fact, same as the weather or the price of feed. My wife Ruth had passed 3 years earlier, cancer that moved faster than anyone expected, and my son Boyd hadn't spoken to me since the funeral. I'd said something to him that day, something I'm not proud of, and he'd said something back that matched it. We were too much alike, him and me, stubborn in the worst ways, the kind of men who'd rather lose everything than admit we were wrong. The diagnosis came in September. Inoperable tumor, the doctor said. Maybe 8 months if I was lucky. I remember driving home from Missoula that afternoon, watching the mountains turn gold in the autumn light, thinking I should feel something. Fear, maybe. Grief. But all I felt was tired. I spent the next few weeks getting my affairs in order. That's the phrase people use, isn't it? Getting your affairs in order. Like death is just paperwork if you file it right. I wrote a letter to the county assessor's office with instructions to auction the land after I was gone. No family to leave it to, not anymore. Boyd had his life in Missoula, his university position, his reasons for staying away. The ranch would go to strangers, and the cattle would go to slaughter. And that would be the end of 50 years of work. The end of everything Ruth and I had built together. I stopped answering the phone. Stopped driving into town for supplies more than I had to. The days shortened, and I fell into a rhythm that felt like waiting. Feed the cattle at dawn, check the fences, eat something, sleep, repeat. The house felt bigger than it used to. Ruth's chair sat empty by the wood stove. Her garden had gone to seed 2 summers ago, and I hadn't touched it since. Mornings I'd find myself talking to her anyway, just to hear a voice in the kitchen. Mine sounded strange to me by then, rough from disuse. I figured I'd made my peace with dying alone. That's what I told myself anyway. It was late October when I first noticed the cattle acting strange. I'd gone out at dusk to close up the barn, and the whole herd was clustered near the east fence instead of grazing the north pasture, where the grass was still good. 32 head of black Angus, pressed together like they were trying to share warmth, even though the temperature was only in the low 40s. I walked out to check on them. They watched me come, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way they kept looking past me, toward the tree line, ears forward, alert in a way I hadn't seen since we'd had wolves in the area back in '04. I turned and looked at the pines. Nothing moved. The wind had died down, and the trees stood motionless against the gray sky. But the cattle wouldn't settle, not for another hour. And when I finally went inside that night, I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching the darkness gather at the edge of my property. Ruth used to say the woods out there watched back. I'd laughed at her for it. I wasn't laughing anymore, not by the time this was over. 3 weeks passed. The days blurred together the way they do when you're not really living them anymore, just moving through. Then the snow came. I woke before dawn on the morning of November 19th to a sound I couldn't place. A low hum, deep and resonant, almost below the range of hearing. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the air itself vibrating with a frequency I felt more than heard. My first thought was the furnace. Old unit, older than the house. I'd been meaning to have it serviced for years. I pulled on my robe and walked through the cold house to check it. The furnace was running fine. Pilot light steady, no strange rattling in the ducts. But the hum persisted for another minute or so, then faded like it had never been there at all. I stood in the hallway, listening to the silence that followed. The cattle were quiet in the barn. No wind outside. Just the soft ticking of the house settling in the cold. When I went to the kitchen to start coffee, I saw the snow through the window. 6 inches had fallen overnight, maybe more. The first real accumulation of the season. Everything was white and still, the fence posts wearing caps of powder, the tree line softened into a gray blur. I drank my coffee and watched the light come up. That's when I noticed the shape on the porch. Something large, dark against the snow, right by my front door. I set down the cup and walked to the door slowly, the way you do when part of you already knows something is wrong. My boots were by the mat, but I didn't bother putting them on. Just opened the door and looked. A bull elk lay on my porch, not the whole animal, just the dressed carcass, gutted, skinned, the meat already sectioned into manageable pieces. The hide had been folded neatly beside it, fur side down. The head was positioned facing east, toward the rising sun, like someone had arranged it that way on purpose. I've butchered animals my whole life. I know what the work looks like when it's done by someone who knows what they're doing. This was cleaner than anything I could have managed. The cuts were precise, professional, almost surgical. My first thought was poachers. Kids from town playing some kind of cruel joke on the dying man out on the county road. I'd had trouble with trespassers before, back when Ruth was alive, and the property looked more kept up. But when I stepped off the porch to look for tracks, that theory fell apart. There were no tire tracks on the access road, no boot prints anywhere in the fresh powder. The only marks in the snow were a line of impressions leading from the tree line, across the north pasture, up to my porch, and back again. Footprints, barefoot, in 6 inches of snow at 20 degrees, and they were massive. I walked out to measure them, my socks soaking through. Each print was at least 18 inches long, sunk deep into the powder. The stride between them was over 4 feet, longer than any man could walk comfortably, let alone in bare feet in the middle of a Montana winter. I followed the tracks to the tree line and stopped. The forest was dark under the pines, the snow thinning where the canopy blocked it. The prints continued into that darkness and disappeared. I stood there for a long time, cold seeping through my wet socks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Nothing made sense. But I didn't call anyone. Not the sheriff, not the game warden, not any of the old friends I'd pushed away over the past 3 years. Who would I have called? What would I have said? I went back inside, changed into dry clothes, and spent the rest of the morning processing the elk meat for my freezer. Whoever, whatever, had left it for me, I wasn't going to let it go to waste. The elk lasted me 3 weeks. Good meat, better than anything I could have bought in town. I told myself that was reason enough not to think too hard about where it came from. But the gifts kept coming. 4 days after the elk, I woke to that same low hum sometime around 3 in the morning. It pulled me out of a dead sleep, that sound, not loud, but impossible to ignore, like standing too close to a power substation, that vibration you feel in your teeth more than hear with your ears. By the time I got to the window, it had already faded. At first light, I found a bundle of kindling on the porch. Dry pine branches, maybe 20 of them, bound together with strips of bark that had been peeled and braided into cord, The knots were tight and even, deliberate. I stood there in my robe and boots, turning that bundle over in my hands, trying to figure out how an animal could do this. I couldn't. 3 nights later, it was huckleberries. A double handful of them, late-season fruit that should have been gone weeks ago, wrapped in fresh moss and left by my door. The berries were perfect. No rot, no frost damage. I ate them with my oatmeal that morning and tried not to think about the tracks I found in the snow. Same size as before. Same impossible stride. Then came the rabbit. I found it on December 3rd, already cleaned and skinned, the pelt rolled up beside it. Whoever had done the work knew what they were doing. The cuts were clean, the meat unspoiled. I'd dressed hundreds of rabbits in my life, and this was as good as any job I'd ever done. Better, maybe. I started sleeping poorly after that. 2-3 hours at a time, then up to check the windows. I'd stand in the dark kitchen, looking out at the snow and the tree line and the nothing that moved out there, and I'd wait. For what? I couldn't say. The hum came every few nights now, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always fading before I could pinpoint where it was coming from. My mind kept trying to find explanations that made sense. Maybe it was old Harlan Jessup from the property next door. He'd always been an odd one. Kept to himself, might have thought he was doing me a kindness. But Harlan had died 2 winters back. Heart attack in his kitchen, 3 days before anyone found him. His land had gone to some development company out of Boise that never did anything with it. There was no one else out here. That was the whole point. The tracks were the thing I couldn't get past. Every morning after a delivery, I'd find them in the snow, those massive barefoot prints leading from the pines to my porch and back again. I measured them with a tape measure from my toolbox. 18 inches, sometimes 19. The stride varied between 4 and 5 feet depending on the terrain. I'd spent 50 years on this land, seen every kind of track there was to see. Deer, elk, moose, bear, mountain lion, wolf. I knew what animal prints looked like. These weren't animal prints. By mid-December, I'd made a decision. I dug out my old Bushnell game camera from the closet where it had sat since Ruth died. She'd bought it for me years ago. Thought I might like to see what wandered through the property at night. I'd used it maybe twice, but now I had a reason. I set it up on the porch rail, pointed toward the tree line, motion activated with infrared for night recording. If something was coming to my door in the dark, I was going to see what it was. 3 nights I waited. 3 nights of that low hum pulling me from sleep. 3 mornings of new tracks in the snow. On the second night, they left a bundle of dried fish. Trout, looked like, smoked and preserved in a way I'd never seen before. On the third night, nothing. Just the tracks, coming and going, and the camera sitting there on the rail. I brought the camera inside on the morning of December 18th, hands shaking as I connected it to my laptop. Ruth's laptop, technically. I'd never learned to use it properly, but I knew enough to pull up the footage. Most of it was nothing. Snow falling, shadows moving in the wind, darkness. Then I found the clip from 3:17 a.m. on the second night, and everything changed. I must have watched that clip 100 times. It started like all the others: snow, darkness, the faint glow of the porch light at the edge of the frame. The timestamp read 3:15 a.m., December 17th. Nothing moved. The trees were still, the pasture empty, the world frozen and silent. Then, at 3:17 and 42 seconds, something entered the frame. It came from the tree line, moving between 2 pines at the far edge of the camera's range. The infrared picked it up as a bright shape against the darker background. Tall, upright, shoulders wider than any man I'd ever seen. It moved with a strange, deliberate gait. Not quite walking, not quite gliding. Smooth in a way that didn't match its size. I paused the footage, zoomed in as much as the old camera would allow. The resolution went to garbage, just pixels and blur. but I could make out the basic shape. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head that seemed too large for the body, or maybe the body was just so massive it threw off my sense of proportion. I hit play again. The figure came closer, crossing the pasture in strides that covered ground faster than they should have. 15 seconds from the tree line to the edge of my porch, a distance of maybe 200 yards. I did the math later. That was almost 30 miles an hour, walking. Not running, walking. At 3:18 and 12 seconds, it stopped. Right at the edge of the porch light's reach, close enough now that the camera could pick up detail. The eyes caught the infrared and reflected back green, 2 bright points in a face I couldn't make out. It stood there for a long moment, motionless, and I had the strangest feeling, even watching the recording hours later, that it was looking directly at the camera. Then the footage dissolved into static. Not interference, not snow on the lens. Static. Like someone had run a magnet over the memory card. It lasted until 5:43 a.m., when the recording suddenly resumed, showing nothing but empty snow and the first gray light of dawn. I sat back in my chair and stared at the frozen image of that static. My hands were trembling. My mouth had gone dry. I should have called someone. The sheriff maybe, or the game warden. Someone with authority. Someone who could come out and look at the tracks and the footage and tell me I wasn't losing my mind. That's what a sensible person would have done. But I knew what would happen if I made that call. They'd come out, ask questions, look at me with that expression people use for old men who've started seeing things. They'd check the camera, find the corrupted footage, and chalk it up to equipment failure. They'd measure the tracks and decide it must have been a bear walking on its hind legs, never mind that no bear in Montana leaves 18-inch footprints. And then they'd leave and I'd still be alone and nothing would have changed except that now people would be talking about crazy old Virgil Crenshaw out on the county road. So I didn't call anyone. Instead, I did something I still can't fully explain. I went to the pantry and took down the jar of honey Ruth had bought years ago, the one I'd never opened because she was gone before we got around to it. I carried it out to the porch, set it on the rail where the camera had been, and stood there in the cold for a long time, looking at the tree line. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I wasn't thinking at all. Maybe something in me had already decided that whatever was out there wasn't trying to hurt me. The elk, the kindling, the berries, the rabbit, the fish, those weren't threats. They were gifts. And where I come from, when someone gives you a gift, you give something back. The honey was gone by morning. In its place was a single pine cone, larger than my fist, placed exactly where the jar had been. I picked it up and held it in my hands, feeling its weight, its realness. Then I went inside and started looking for something else to leave. The honey was just the start. After the pine cone, I left a wool blanket on the porch, one of the old ones from the cedar chest, the kind Ruth used to put out when the nights turned bitter. It was gone by morning. In its place, a bundle of dried fish wrapped in broad leaves I didn't recognize, preserved in a way that kept the meat tender and faintly smoky. I left a pair of leather work gloves, the ones with the worn palms I'd been meaning to replace. Gone. They left a twist of sweetgrass braided so tight it looked like rope, and when I brought it inside, the smell filled the kitchen for days. Then I found the transistor radio. It was sitting on a shelf in the mudroom, hadn't worked right in years. Ruth used to listen to it while she gardened, tuning in to the country station out of Missoula. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I couldn't stand to hear it either. So it sat there collecting dust, waiting for something. I left it on the porch rail on the night of December 22nd. By morning, it was gone. They left me a stone. Not just any stone, a flat, smooth river rock that fit perfectly in my palm, like it had been chosen for my hand specifically. I turned it over and over, feeling its weight, its coolness, the way it seemed to belong there. I put it in my coat pocket and carried it with me for the rest of that winter. The exchange had become something else now, a ritual, a conversation without words. I started talking to them, not out loud at first, just in my head, while I set out whatever I'd chosen that night. "This is coffee," I'd think, holding up the tin before I placed it on the rail. "It's bitter, but it warms you up. Ruth liked it with cream and sugar. I take it black." But after a while, I stopped caring if anyone might hear. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and who was going to see me? The cattle didn't judge, so I talked. I explained what each thing was, where it came from, why I thought they might like it. I told them about Ruth, about the ranch, about the 50 years I'd spent walking this land. I told them I was dying. I don't know why I said it. The words just came out one night, standing on the porch in the dark, my breath fogging in the cold air. I said, "I don't have much time left. The doctors gave me 8 months, and half of that's already gone. I just thought you should know." The hum came that night, longer than usual, almost like a response. And in the morning, they'd left something different, a cluster of roots I didn't recognize, dark and gnarled, smelling of earth and something sharp underneath. I didn't know what to do with them, so I put them in a jar on the windowsill and left them there. By late December, I'd stopped writing letters to the county. The auction instructions sat unfinished on my desk, buried under feed receipts and old newspapers. I wasn't thinking about dying anymore. I was thinking about what to leave on the porch, what might appear in its place, what the next night might bring. For the first time in 3 years, I had something to wait for. Christmas came and went. I didn't notice. New Year's passed the same way. Just another night, another offering, another gift in return. The snow kept falling, the cold kept deepening, and the exchange continued. I should have been scared. That's what I tell myself now, looking back. A rational person would have been terrified. Strange creatures visiting in the night, evidence of intelligence I couldn't explain, a relationship building with something that shouldn't exist. But I wasn't scared. I was grateful. They'd given me a reason to keep living. And in that long, dark winter, with Ruth gone and Boyd lost to me and my body failing a little more each day, that was worth more than I can say. February came in mean. The temperature dropped to 20 below and stayed there, the kind of cold that kills cattle if you're not careful. I spent most of my days in the barn, checking on the herd, breaking ice in the water troughs, hauling extra feed. My body wasn't up to it anymore. I could feel that in my bones, in the way my hands shook when I gripped the pitchfork, in the shortness of breath that came after any exertion. But the work still needed doing, and there was no one else to do it. The offerings had continued through January, though less frequently now. Once a week, maybe twice. The hum still came in the deep hours of the night, and I still left things on the porch. Smaller tokens now, things I could spare. A book I'd already read, a tin of sardines, an old pocket watch that had belonged to my father. They always took what I left. They always left something in return. On the night of February 9th, I went out to the barn at dusk to check on a heifer that had been showing signs of distress. She was young, first pregnancy, and I was worried she might be having trouble. The walk from the house to the barn was maybe 200 yards, a distance I'd covered 10,000 times over the years. I made it about halfway before my legs gave out. There was no warning. One moment I was walking, boots crunching on the frozen snow, and the next I was on the ground, staring up at the darkening sky, unable to move. The cold hit me immediately, not gradual, not creeping, but all at once, like being plunged into ice water. I tried to push myself up and couldn't. My arms wouldn't respond. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I lay there in the snow, watching my breath frost in the air above me, and thought, this is it. This is how I die. The irony wasn't lost on me. All those months of waiting for the tumor to take me, and instead I was going to freeze to death 50 yards from my own barn. Time became strange after that. I drifted in and out, the cold numbing everything until I couldn't feel my hands or feet anymore. The sky went from gray to black, stars appearing one by one. I thought about Ruth, about Boyd, about all the things I should have said and never did. I thought about the letter on my desk, still unfinished. I thought about the county auctioning off the land, strangers walking through the house Ruth and I had built together. I thought about dying alone, the way I'd always known I would. Then I felt something. Warmth first. A heat source close to my body, cutting through the cold. Then pressure. Hands, I realized, though my mind couldn't make sense of the size of them. I was being lifted, cradled against something massive and warm, something that smelled like pine and earth and musk. I tried to open my eyes, tried to see what was carrying me. I couldn't. The darkness took me before I had the chance. I woke in my own bed. For a long moment, I didn't move, just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what had happened. The last thing I remembered was the cold, the snow, the certainty that I was dying. Now I was inside, under blankets, warm in a way that didn't make sense. The fire in the wood stove was burning high, flames crackling behind the glass door. I could see it from the bed, casting orange light across the walls. Someone had stoked it recently. The logs were fresh, the heat radiating through the room in waves. I sat up slowly, my body aching in places I didn't know could ache. My boots were off, set neatly by the bedroom door. My coat hung on the chair across the room, the Carhartt I'd been wearing when I collapsed. That's when I saw the handprints. They were on the sleeve of the coat, clearly, visible even in the low light. Mud and something darker, dirt maybe or dried moss, pressed into the canvas in the shape of hands. But not human hands. These were too large, the fingers too long, the proportions wrong in ways that made my stomach turn. I got out of bed and crossed the room on unsteady legs, picked up the coat and held it closer to the light. The handprints were the size of dinner plates. Each finger was as long as my palm, thick and distinct. There were 2 of them on the left sleeve, overlapping slightly, like whoever had grabbed me needed both hands to hold on. I stood there for a long time, coat in my hands, trying to understand. Something had found me in the snow. Something had carried me 200 yards across the frozen pasture, through my front door, into my house. Something had removed my boots, hung up my coat, stoked my fire, and left. All without waking me. All without leaving any trace except these prints on my sleeve. I checked the door. Locked from the inside. The deadbolt thrown the way I always left it. The windows were latched. There was no sign of forced entry. No indication that anything had come through except those massive handprints and the fire that shouldn't have been burning. I went to the kitchen and sat at the table, the coat spread out in front of me. The clock on the wall said 4:17 in the morning. I'd been out in the snow for hours, long enough that I should be dead. Hypothermia sets in fast at 20 below. I knew that. Everyone who lives out here knows that. But I wasn't dead. I wasn't even frostbitten, as far as I could tell. My fingers and toes ached with returning circulation, but the skin was pink and healthy. Whatever had carried me inside had done it fast enough, kept me warm enough, that the cold hadn't had time to do its damage. I thought about the offerings, the elk, the kindling, the berries and fish, the gifts I'd left in return, the honey, the blankets, the radio, the exchange. They'd been watching me. All those weeks, all those nights, they'd been watching. And when I needed help, when I was lying in the snow waiting to die, they'd come. I put my head in my hands and sat there until the sun came up. I didn't cry. I was too hollowed out for that, too overwhelmed by the weight of what had happened. But something shifted in me that morning, something I couldn't name. The fear I should have felt was absent. In its place was something closer to wonder. And underneath that, for the first time in 6 years, a desperate need to talk to my son. The phone sat on the counter where it always sat. Same place it had been since Ruth picked it out 15 years ago. I'd ignored it for months now, letting calls go to voicemail, deleting messages without listening to them. There was no one I wanted to talk to, no one who would understand. But that morning, still wearing yesterday's clothes, the coat with those impossible handprints draped over the, kitchen chair. I picked up the phone and dialed Boyd's number. He answered on the fourth ring. His voice was guarded, the way it always was when he saw my number. Expecting an argument, probably. Expecting the same bitter silence that had defined every conversation we'd had since his mother's funeral. "Dad?" A pause. "Is everything okay?" I opened my mouth to answer and found I didn't know where to start. How do you tell your son, your estranged son, the wildlife biologist, the man who built his whole career on evidence and peer review, that something impossible has been leaving gifts on your porch for months? That something shone you out of the snow last night and saved your life? "Boyd," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Rough, shaken. "I need you to come to the ranch." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, what's going on?" "I can't explain it over the phone. I know how that sounds. I know you think I stopped, took a breath. Something's happening out here. Something I can't explain. And I need someone to see it. I need you to see it." "Are you sick? Did something happen with the diagnosis?" "This isn't about that." I looked at the coat, at those handprints. "I'm not losing my mind, Boyd. I know that's what you're thinking, and I don't blame you. But I'm asking you, I'm begging you to come out here. Just for a few days. Just to see." The silence stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. I could hear him breathing, could almost hear him thinking. All those years of distance between us. All the things we'd said and couldn't take back. "Please," I said. It was the first time I'd said that word to him since he was a child. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer. "I can come Friday, after my last class." "Friday," I repeated. "Okay, Friday." "Dad." He hesitated. "Are you sure you're all right?" I looked out the window at the tree line, at the snow covering the pasture, at the place where I'd almost died 12 hours ago. "No," I said. "I don't think I am, but I think I need to be not all right with someone else for a while." After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen and cried. First time since Ruth's funeral. The tears came hard and wouldn't stop, and I let them, because there was no one to see, and nothing left to hide behind. My son was coming home. Whatever else happened, that was something. Boyd's Subaru pulled up the drive on Friday afternoon, mud-spattered and out of place next to my old Ford. I watched him from the kitchen window, saw him sit in the car for a long moment before getting out. Steeling himself, probably. Preparing for whatever version of his father he was about to find. He looked older than I remembered. 43 now, though I had to do the math to be sure. Gray at the temples, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at Ruth's funeral. He carried himself like a man used to being careful, measured movements, watchful gaze. The scientist in him, always observing. I met him on the porch. We stood there for an awkward moment, neither of us sure what to do. A handshake felt too formal. A hug felt like too much. In the end, I just stepped aside and let him in. "Coffee's on," I said. "You still take it black?" "Yeah." He looked around the kitchen, taking in the details. Ruth's chair, still empty. The coat draped over the back of mine, handprints visible in the afternoon light. "Dad, what's going on?" I poured him a cup and sat down across from him. Then I told him everything. The elk on the porch, the tracks in the snow, the offerings that kept coming, week after week, the game camera footage, the shape, the green eyes, the static, the exchange I'd started, leaving things and finding things in return. And finally, the night in February when I collapsed in the pasture and woke up in my own bed, carried there by something I never saw. Boyd listened without interrupting. His face didn't change, but I could see him processing, filing things away, looking for explanations that fit his training. When I finished, he picked up the coat and examined the handprints for a long time. "You said you have the camera footage?" "On Ruth's laptop. I'll show you." The first 2 days were like that. Professional. Distant. Boyd examined the tracks I'd photographed, measured the stride length, noted the depth of the impressions in different snow conditions. He watched the footage over and over, frame by frame, looking for signs of manipulation or misidentification. He walked the perimeter of the property, checked the tree line, studied the ground for evidence I might have missed. He didn't say he believed me, but he didn't say I was crazy either. On the third night, everything changed. We were sitting in the kitchen after dinner, the conversation stilted, both of us talking around the things we really needed to say. Then Boyd stopped mid-sentence, his head turning toward the window. "Do you hear that?" I listened. And there it was, that low, resonant hum coming from the direction of the north pasture. The same sound I'd been hearing for months, the one I'd first mistaken for the furnace. Boyd's face went pale. He stood slowly, moving to the window, staring out at the darkness. "That's not mechanical," he said quietly. "That's biological. That's a vocalization." "I know." He turned to look at me, and for the first time since he'd arrived, I saw something other than skepticism in his eyes. I saw fear, and underneath it, something that might have been wonder. "What the hell is out there, Dad?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but they've been watching over me, and I think they wanted you to hear." Boyd insisted we investigate the north pasture at first light. I hadn't been out there since November. My body wasn't up to the walk anymore, and there'd been no reason to check on that section of the property. The cattle avoided it. Had for months now. I'd noticed, but hadn't thought much of it. Boyd had brought equipment from Missoula, a thermal camera, audio recorders, GPS unit, sampling kit. He loaded everything into a pack, and we set out just after dawn, our breath fogging in the cold air. The snow was deep out there, past our knees in some places. Boyd moved ahead, breaking trail, and I followed as best I could. My lungs burned with the effort, but I needed to see whatever he was going to find. We spotted it from about 50 yards away. A structure. That's the only word for it. Nearly 8 feet tall, made of branches stripped of bark and woven together in patterns I'd never seen before. Triangles interlocking with triangles, the geometry too precise to be random, too deliberate to be natural. Boyd stopped dead. I watched his face as he processed what he was seeing, the scientist confronting something that didn't fit any framework he'd ever been taught. "No animal builds like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No known animal." He spent the next 2 hours documenting everything. Photographs from every angle, measurements of the structure's height, width, the diameter of the branches used, samples of the bark, the binding material, the soil around the base. He worked in silence, methodical and focused, but his hands shook the entire time. I stood back and watched, thinking about Ruth. She'd always said the woods watched back. I'd laughed at her. I wasn't laughing now. That night, Boyd set up his equipment around the property. Thermal cameras covering the tree line, audio recorders positioned to triangulate any sounds. He worked until well after dark, running cables, checking angles, testing connections. When he finally came inside, we ate dinner together in the kitchen. And for the first time in 6 years, we actually talked. About Ruth, about the funeral, about the things we'd said to each other that day, the words that had driven us apart. "I shouldn't have said what I said," Boyd told me, "about you not being there for her at the end. That wasn't fair." I shook my head. It was true. I wasn't there. Not the way I should have been. Neither was I. We sat with that for a while. The silence between us different now. Less like a wall, more like a bridge. Whatever was out there in the woods, it had given us this. A reason to be in the same room again. A reason to try. The audio equipment captured something on the third night. Boyd had set up 3 recorders around the property. One near the barn, one at the edge of the north pasture, one on the porch itself. Professional-grade equipment, the kind he used for field research. He'd explained the specifications to me, but most of it went over my head. What I understood was that these machines could pick up sounds human ears couldn't hear. That morning, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, running the recordings through some kind of analysis software. I watched the screen over his shoulder, saw chasse, the lines and graphs that meant nothing to me. Boyd's face was tight with concentration, his jaw working the way it did when he was thinking hard. Then he stopped, leaned closer to the screen, played something back. I didn't hear anything at first, just silence, the flat hiss of empty audio. But Boyd was staring at the waveform like it had insulted him. "There," he said, pointing at a section of the graph. 2:47 a.m. All 3 recorders picked it up simultaneously. I don't hear anything. You wouldn't. It's at 14 hertz, well below the threshold of human hearing. He did something with the software, adjusting settings I didn't understand. I'm going to speed it up, shift it into audible range. Just brace yourself. He hit play. The sound that came out of the laptop speakers was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Low and resonant, almost like a voice, but stretched and distorted in ways that made my skin crawl. It rose and fell in patterns that felt deliberate, structured. Not random noise, but something with intention behind it. And then my stomach turned. It hit us both at the same time. A wave of nausea, sudden and overwhelming, accompanied by a pressure behind my eyes that made me grab the edge of the table. Boyd shoved back from the laptop, his face going pale. "Jesus," he breathed. "What the hell?" He stopped the playback. The nausea faded slowly, leaving behind a dull headache and a feeling of wrongness I couldn't shake. Boyd ran the frequency analysis twice more, checking his work. His hands were trembling. When he finally looked at me, something had changed in his eyes. The skepticism was gone. In its place was something closer to fear. "Infrasound at that frequency can cause physical symptoms," he said, his voice flat and clinical. "Nausea, disorientation, feelings of dread. It's documented. But Dad..." He stopped, rubbed his jaw, looked back at the screen. "No known primate produces vocalizations at 14 hertz. Elephants communicate around 20. Whales can go lower, but this pattern isn't whale song. It's too structured, too complex." "What are you saying?" He shook his head slowly. "I'm saying that whatever made this sound is communicating. In a frequency range we can't naturally perceive, a language we were never meant to hear." We sat in silence for a long time after that. The laptop screen glowed between us, that waveform frozen on the display like evidence of something neither of us knew how to name. I thought about all those nights I'd heard the hum, that low vibration I'd felt more than heard, the one I'd blamed on the furnace, on the wind, on my aging ears playing tricks. They'd been talking the whole time, and I'd never known. "Boyd," I said finally, "what do we do now?" He looked at me, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he didn't have an answer. Neither of us slept that night. Boyd's final evening at the ranch, and we both knew something was going to happen. You could feel it in the air, that heaviness, that sense of waiting. The cattle had been restless all day, clustering near the barn the way they had back in October when this all started. We sat in the kitchen with the lights off, watching the tree line through the window. Boyd had his camera on the table beside him, but he hadn't touched it in hours. I had a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Neither of us spoke, There wasn't anything left to say. The clock on the wall read 1:47 when the hum started. Louder this time. Closer. I could feel it in my chest, that low vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Boyd's hand moved toward his camera, then stopped. At 2:03 they came. 3 figures emerged from the tree line, maybe 200 yards out. Even at that distance, I could tell they weren't human. Too tall, too broad, moving with a fluidity that didn't match their size. They walked upright, one after another, crossing the snow-covered pasture in that slow, deliberate gait I'd seen on the game camera footage months ago. They stopped at the edge of the yard, maybe 50 feet from the house, and they stood there. I don't know how to describe what that felt like, watching them, knowing they were watching us. The largest one was in front, easily 8 feet tall, shoulders wider than the doorframe. The other 2 flanked it on either side, slightly smaller but just as still. Boyd reached for his camera. His hand hovered over it for a long moment. Then he pulled back. I understood. Some things aren't meant to be captured. Some things you just have to witness. They stood there for nearly 40 minutes. I know because I watched the clock, tracking the time the way you do when reality stops making sense. 40 minutes of silence, of stillness, of 3 impossible figures standing in the snow like monuments to everything science said couldn't exist. Then, slowly, they began to move again. The 2 smaller ones turned first, heading back toward the tree line. The largest one lingered. It walked to the porch. I could hear its footsteps now, heavy and deliberate, the boards creaking under a weight I couldn't imagine. It stopped just outside the window, close enough that if I'd reached out, I could have touched the glass between us. I saw its hand, massive, long-fingered, moving with surprising delicacy as it placed something on the porch rail. Then it turned and followed the others into the darkness. Boyd and I sat there until dawn, neither of us willing to move, neither of us willing to break whatever spell had settled over the house. When the sun finally came up, I went outside to see what they'd left. It was sitting on the porch rail, right where the largest one had placed it. My transistor radio, the one I'd left as an offering back in December, the one Ruth used to listen to while she worked in her garden. I'd given it away without really thinking about it. Just another item in the exchange, another gesture in a conversation I didn't fully understand. But it wasn't the same radio anymore. I picked it up slowly, turning it over in my hands. The casing was the same, that faded brown plastic, the scratch on the corner from when I'd dropped it years ago. But everything else had changed. The antenna had been extended somehow, lengthened with a material I couldn't identify, not metal, not wood, something in between that caught the morning light with a dull gleam. The back panel had been removed and reattached, and through the seams I could see components that hadn't been there before. Wires rerouted, parts added. The whole thing reassembled in a configuration that made no sense to me. Boyd came out onto the porch, still wearing yesterday's clothes. Neither of us had slept. He saw the radio in my hands and went still. "Is that—" "Yeah." I held it out to him. They brought it back. He took it carefully, like it might break or bite, turned it over the way I had, examining the modifications with that clinical focus I'd watched him use all week. His brow furrowed. He opened the back panel, studied the interior, closed it again. "This doesn't make sense," he said quietly. "The circuitry's been completely reworked. Some of these connections shouldn't function. The materials—" He stopped, shook his head. "I don't even know what some of these materials are. Does it work?" He looked at me, then at the radio. Slowly, he turned the dial. Static at first, the familiar hiss of empty frequencies. Then, as he moved through the bands, something caught. A signal, faint but clear, growing stronger as he fine-tuned the dial. Music. It was an old song, something from the 40s or 50s, the kind of thing Ruth would have recognized. A woman's voice backed by strings, singing about love and loss and coming home. The signal was impossibly clean for a radio this old, this far from any major station. Boyd checked the frequency. His face went pale. "This station doesn't exist," he said. "Not at this frequency. Not anywhere in the broadcast range we should be able to pick up out here." He looked up at me. "Dad, this radio is receiving a signal that shouldn't be possible." I took it back from him, held it to my ear, listened to that distant music floating through the speaker. I thought about Ruth, about all the afternoons she'd spent in the garden with this radio playing beside her. I thought about the creature that had stood on my porch last night, close enough to touch, leaving this impossible gift for me to find. "They fixed it," I said, "or improved it. I don't know which." Boyd didn't answer. He was staring at the radio like it had personally betrayed everything he'd ever believed about the world. We went back inside. Boyd made coffee, moving through the motions mechanically, his mind clearly somewhere else. I sat at the kitchen table with the radio in front of me, listening to that faint music, thinking about what it meant. They'd taken something I'd given them. They'd studied it, understood it, and made it better. Not just functional, transcendent. A radio that could pick up signals beyond its design, beyond the laws of physics as Boyd understood them. This wasn't animal behavior. This wasn't instinct or accident. This was intelligence, problem-solving, communication. They were showing us what they could do. Boyd packed his equipment in silence that afternoon. The thermal cameras, the audio recorders, the samples from the stick structure. All of it went into cases and bags loaded into the back of his Subaru. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man walking through a dream he couldn't wake from. Before he left, we stood together on the porch, looking out at the tree line. The snow had started falling again, soft flakes drifting down from a gray sky. "I'm not going to file a report," Boyd said. "I'm not going to tell anyone at the university." I nodded. I'd known he wouldn't. "It's not that I don't believe it," he continued. "It's that..." He stopped, rubbed his jaw, that familiar gesture I'd watched him make 100 times over the past week. "Some things aren't meant to be studied. Some things you just witness." "Your mother used to say the woods watched back," I told him. I laughed at her, told her she was being superstitious. Boyd looked at me. "What do you think now?" I thought about the elk on my porch, the kindling bound with bark, the night they'd carried me out of the snow and saved my life, the 40 minutes they'd stood in my pasture, letting us see them, letting us understand. "I think Ruth was smarter than me," I said, "about a lot of things." Boyd almost smiled at that. He reached out and squeezed my shoulder, the first time he'd touched me in 6 years. "I'll be back," he said. "Soon." And he was. I outlived my diagnosis by 3 years. The doctors couldn't explain it. When I went back to Missoula for my follow-up scans in the spring of 2020, Dr. Volk looked at the images for a long time before she said anything. The tumor was still there, hadn't shrunk, hadn't disappeared, but it had stopped growing. "Completely arrested," she said. "A statistical anomaly. One of those rare cases where the body does something medicine can't account for." I didn't tell her about the creatures. Didn't tell her about the roots they'd left me that first winter, the ones I'd kept in a jar on my windowsill, without knowing what to do with them. I'd made a tea from them one night, on a whim, and drunk it before bed. Couldn't say if that had anything to do with my survival. Probably didn't. But I kept making that tea once a week until the roots ran out. Boyd started visiting regularly after that February. Once a month at first, then every few weeks. He never brought his equipment again, never tried to document what was happening on the ranch. He just came to see me to sit in the kitchen and drink coffee and talk about things we should have talked about years ago. The rift between us healed slowly, the way all deep wounds do. We didn't have a single moment of reconciliation, No tearful apology that fixed everything. We just kept showing up for each other, kept choosing to try, and eventually the scar tissue softened into something that could bear weight again. He told me, eventually, what he'd said at Ruth's funeral. The thing that had matched my cruelty, the words he'd carried with him for 6 years like stones in his pockets. I won't repeat them here. Some things are meant to stay between father and son. I told him I forgave him. He told me the same. And we meant it, both of us, in a way we couldn't have meant it before. The offerings continued, though less frequently as the years passed. Once a month, then once a season. A bundle of herbs in spring, a perfect trout in summer, a stack of firewood in fall, cut and split and stacked by hands I never saw. I kept leaving things in return, small tokens, gestures of gratitude, and they kept disappearing, and the conversation continued without words. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear the hum, that low vibration that meant they were close, watching, present. I'd stand at the window and look out at the darkness, knowing they were there even when I couldn't see them. It felt like being watched over, protected, cared for by something I would never fully understand. In the spring of 2023, my body finally started to give out. The tumor hadn't grown, but I was 75 years old and worn down by decades of hard work and harsh winters. My heart was failing, my lungs struggling, my strength fading day by day. When I called Boyd and told him I didn't think I had much time left, he drove up that same afternoon and didn't leave again. He moved into the guest room, Ruth's old sewing room, and took over the daily work of keeping me alive, cooking meals I couldn't finish, helping me to the bathroom when I couldn't make it alone, sitting with me on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun go down over the mountains. On one of the last good nights, when I still had enough strength to walk, I asked him to bring me my camera. The old 35mm Ruth had given me for our 25th anniversary, the one I hadn't touched since she died. "Help me outside, I said. "I want to wait for them." Boyd didn't argue. He helped me into my coat, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and walked me out to the porch. We sat together in the darkness, father and son, watching the tree line the way we had that night 3 years before. They didn't come. We waited until dawn, until the sky turned pink and gold over the bitterroots, and the pasture stayed empty. No figures emerged from the pines. No hum vibrated through the darkness. Just silence and cold, and the two of us alone. I raised the camera anyway, took photographs of the tree line, the pasture, the snow that had started to melt with the coming spring. A whole roll of film, 36 exposures, shot at nothing in particular, but I labeled it anyway when we went back inside. My handwriting was shaky by then, hard to read. I wrote, "They came to say goodbye, because they had. Not that night, but all the nights before. All the offerings and exchanges and moments of presence I'd been given over those 4 years. They'd been saying goodbye the whole time, in the only language we shared. 3 days later, I died in my sleep, my son holding my hand. This is Boyd now. My father asked me to finish telling this story, if it ever came to that. So here I am, keeping a promise to a man I almost lost twice, once to pride and once to something I still can't explain. Dad passed on April 12th, 2023. Peaceful in his sleep, the way he would have wanted. I was holding his hand when it happened, felt the moment his grip went slack, felt the warmth start to leave his fingers. I sat there with him for a long time afterward, not ready to let go, not ready to make the calls that would start the machinery of death. The coroner, the funeral home, the lawyer with the will I'd helped him rewrite 2 years before. The ranch is still mine. I can't bring myself to sell it. I moved back to Montana full-time after I left the university. Quietly, without announcement or explanation. My colleagues thought I was having some kind of breakdown, and maybe I was. But the truth is simpler. I couldn't keep teaching a discipline that I knew, in my bones, was incomplete. I couldn't stand in front of students and talk about wildlife behavior and habitat analysis when I'd seen things that shattered every framework I'd ever been taught. So I came back to the bitter roots, back to the 1,200 acres my father worked for 50 years, back to the place where my mother is buried, and my father lies beside her now, in the little family plot behind the north pasture where the stick structure used to stand. The structure is gone, by the way. Disappeared sometime in the summer of 2021. I went out to check on it and found nothing but an empty clearing. The branches removed so completely there wasn't even a trace they'd been there. I don't know what that means. I've stopped trying to figure out what any of it means. The offerings stopped after Dad died. I kept leaving things on the porch for a while. Habit, maybe, or hope, but nothing ever vanished, and nothing ever appeared in return. Whatever relationship my father had built with them, it was his alone. They'd been watching over him, caring for him in their strange way, and when he was gone, they moved on. But they're still out there. I know they are. Neighbors report lights in the tree line on winter nights, strange sounds that carry across the valley, low hums, distant calls, things that don't match any animal in the field guides. A hunting party found tracks last fall up near the ridge where Dad's property borders the national forest. 18 inches long, 5-foot stride. They reported it to Fish and Wildlife, and a ranger came out to investigate, and nothing ever came of it. Nothing ever does. I keep a safe deposit box in Helena. Inside it are the photographs I took during that week in 2020, thermal images of the stick structure, stills from the game camera footage, pictures of the modified radio that still sits on my father's kitchen table, still picking up stations that shouldn't exist. I've never shown them to anyone. I don't know if I ever will. And there's one more thing in that box. A roll of film, 36 exposures, shot by my father on one of his last nights alive. He labeled it himself, in that shaky handwriting I'll never see again. They came to say goodbye. I've never had it developed. Part of me is afraid of what I'll find. Afraid that the photographs will show nothing, just empty snow, empty trees, empty darkness. And I'll have to accept that my father's mind was going at the end, that everything he experienced was just the hallucinations of a dying man. But a bigger part of me is afraid of the opposite, afraid that the photographs will show exactly what he said they would. Proof, undeniable and permanent, that something was out there, something intelligent, something that watched over a lonely old rancher in his final years and showed him a kindness that humans couldn't. Some truths aren't meant to be proven. Some things you just carry. That's what I've learned, living out here on my father's land, walking the same paths he walked, watching the same tree line he watched every night for 4 years. The world is bigger than we know, older than we imagine, full of things that don't fit into our categories and frameworks and carefully constructed certainties. My father understood that at the end. I think my mother understood it too, long before either of us. The woods watch back. They always have. And if you ever find yourself alone in the bitter roots, late at night, with the snow falling and the silence pressing in, pay attention. Listen for the hum. Look for the tracks. They're out there, and they're paying attention too.